Hi, I'm John Knight Lundwall. Welcome to Myth and the Bible. Tonight's presentation, we're going to go over what is myth, specifically how myth was created or how theorists think it was created in the ancient world, what function it served. I am linking a video in the top corner right now that you should watch. It's 26 minutes long. It's S3, the Mythic Canon. In this video, I lay out how I believe the ancient oral world worked, how they organized their societies, and how they transmitted, passed down their traditions and their knowledge. Myth was part of that mythic oral canon. And so that is my theoretical framework when dealing with myth, so I suggest you watch it. But this presentation, we're going to just examine not only myth, but how academics have approached myth and how that applies to biblical studies. All right, the first thing we have to know when studying myth is that all definitions of myth are actually theories. There are a variety of competing theories as to what ancient myth was. So there's no common agreement in academia. Lots of people disagree with each other. And a lot of people agree with elements of each other. So it's kind of a morass. But basically, a theory of myth ends in a definition. So when you read a definition, what you're really reading is a theory. And in fact, by the 1980s, academia pretty much understood that we simply don't have enough information to resolve all the contours of ancient mythology. Too many pieces are lost. As a result, in academia, myth programs, folklore programs began disappearing. And today there's only a few left. In fact, the program I went to is the only graduate program in the United States that offers comparative myth. Thought we would begin just with your basic modern dictionary definition of myth. This is Merriam-Webster's online dictionary. And its first, most prominent definition is, myth is a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. Turns out that's a pretty good general definition of how ancient myth functioned. It is a traditional story within a culture, ostensibly historical. We're going to be talking about that. In fact, our next presentation is the intersection between myth and history. It's actually very important, especially when studying the Bible. To unfold part of a worldview of a people, explain a practice, many myths are ideological narratives. That is, they explain the origin of something, the origin of the world, creation stories, but also the origin of a plant or a bird or a people. So as a very basic general definition, that's actually not a bad one. But there are other popular ideas and definitions of myth, and I thought we would go over those. Whatever myth is, it's not literature. And largely because myth programs have been dropped, they've been relegated into the humanities departments, and they're studied as literature. You read Homer. And in modern American universities, myth has been really reduced to reading Homer. Every once in a while, you might read a Greek play, Sophocles or Euripides, as part of your myth studies. Homer has mythic content, but the epics of Homer are not myth, and so already some academics are going to disagree with me. But another definition the dictionary gives us is a popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone, especially one embodying the ideals and institutions of a society or segment of society. This is the myth of eternal progress, or the myth of, these are cultural values or institutions that get, a tradition built up around them. The word myth is definitely applied to this, but this is not ancient myth. And then the most actually commonly used usage of the word myth is this last one, an unfounded or false notion. People are constantly saying, oh, such and such is a myth, using it pejoratively as in it's not true. Whatever ancient myth was, it represented the ultimate truth to the oral peoples telling them. So clearly, this modern idea of myth has nothing to do with ancient myth. And so, so now we have some issues here. That first definition is good. The rest of them are modern takes on myth, and start walking away from what ancient myth actually was. Well, look, I'm going to go over three major schools of very smart people trying to tackle the subject of ancient mythology, just so that you can get a sense as to how, in the 20th century at least, how academics tackled the problem. From the late 1800s all the way up till the 1930s, 40s, there was a major school of myth interpretation called the myth ritual theory, or the myth ritual school. Its leaders were Jane Ellen Harrison. This is a drawing of her. Gilbert Murray, Lord Raglan. And basically their theory was all myths belong to rituals. Myths were narrative aspects of rituals. And it was a universalist theory, as all the 20th century theories of myth were, and that is they wanted, a theory of everything. They wanted a theory that would explain all of mythology, and with it almost all of ancient humanity and society. One of the great weaknesses of all the myth theories in the 20th century is that they were all universalist theories. Everyone was trying to explain, using the scientific method, how humanity emerged out of the wilderness, through evolution. And so this is just a problem that we run into with every theory. Having said that, the myth ritual theory, it fell out of favor because they defined myth as that which only belonged to ritual. So if they could not find a story attached to a ritual, it was not a myth. And of course, people began finding traditional sacred narratives in cultures not being able to attach it to a ritual, and then saying, well, then there's a problem with this theory. Of course, very often the rituals get lost, and sometimes just telling a story. One of the things about ancient myths is they were not campfire stories. They just weren't stories you could tell any time. You had to tell them in a specific season, very often in a specific place, and very often in a specific way. And turns out, because of this specificity, just the telling of a myth itself could be labeled as ritualistic. And so, bottom line, the myth ritual theory grew into disfavor as more scholars began pushing back against how universal it had become. And so, but I should point out, Lord Raglan, for example, made the note that in the writings of Herodotus, our first, the father of history, whenever Herodotus references an ancient myth, it is always in connection with either a ritual or a temple in which the rituals took place. And sure enough, if you read Herodotus, he's right. And so my personal take is I believe the myth ritual theory is largely correct. Myth is wed to ritual in the ancient world, and there's a specific reason for that in my view, and that is because oral peoples without writing, must perform their memories. And they do that in some sort of ritual environment, whether it be a dance, a chant, it could be a drama. So very often, as in almost always, this kind of happens. And so it turns out I am a proponent of the myth ritual theory, even though I disagree that not every narrative must be attached to a specific ritual. Another theory of myth was the psychological theory, espoused by Sigmund Freud down here, Carl Jung, and later by Joseph Campbell. The psychological theory, again, it covered most of the 20th century. Sigmund Freud really wasn't espousing a theory of myth. He was developing a theory of the human psyche. Every once in a while, he would talk about a myth, but largely not very accurately or smartly, because that wasn't his field of study. He was trying to demonstrate how the human psyche worked. Carl Jung, on the other hand, who at first was very closely allied with Sigmund Freud, they were friends. Freud wanted Jung to be his acolyte and his successor, but in the end, they couldn't even end up talking to each other because they profoundly disagreed with each of their different theoretical frameworks about the human psyche. But Jung specifically took ancient mythologies and used them to develop his theory of the human psyche, which was that consciousness derives from the unconscious. There is a collective unconscious in which all conscious beings are associated with. And mythologies are largely autonomously created images that we get in dreams, or just in intuitions, in flashes, deja vu, where these images are emerging from the collective unconscious, and they are emerging into consciousness as a way to generally solve a duality, an opposition for psychological improvement, individuation, Jung called it. So again, Jung is using a psychological theory to which he is applying the material of myth, but he definitely believes that ancient mythologies were, the people who created them were more closely allied to the collective unconscious, and therefore they thought more in mythic terms. Now, I strongly disagree with this view, despite the fact that, again, you can agree with all these theories because they all have problems. My own theory of myth will have problems, but you shouldn't throw them away, because the amount of data that someone like Carl Jung collected to try to prove his theory is enormous, and the discoveries he made along the way are, they're amazing. And so even if you disagree with that particular approach, so much is learned and discovered. Well, Joseph Campbell is a post-Jung. He follows the traditions of Jung. And for Joseph Campbell, he developed the monomyth theory, which is his hero with 1,000 faces. Basically, every hero in myth followed this same psychological pattern that derived from the collective unconscious, and that if you studied the mythologies of the hero in different cultures and sort of mapped out those myths and their plots, you would find that there was a common theme, very often called the hero's journey, that the hero had to go through. Campbell maps it all out. And of course, his theory is that this is the collective unconscious coming up to help us go on our own psychological journey of healing, of improvement, of individuation. So Campbell was very popular. The thing about Campbell's theory of myth is that it modernized myths, but the weakness of his theory is it's non-differentiating, and that is all stories, all narratives can be said to be doing this. And so how do you differentiate something like the ancient labors of Heracles with the modern story of Star Wars? In fact, if you read, Campbellian writing, people write about Star Wars as if it's a myth. And they go through the hero's journey. In fact, George Lucas read a ton of Joseph Campbell while writing the screenplay to Star Wars. And so the journey of Luke Skywalker really is this hero's journey that is occurring. Well, so there's a problem in the theory. I mean, one of the problems is you can't disprove it. It applies to all narratives. And the other problem is that it's non-differentiating, and that is, how do you differentiate an ancient story from a modern one? Is there a difference? Well, most scholars say yes, there are huge differences, and this theoretical framework does not provide enough grist to make substantial differences. Again, it's a universalist theory. It tries to explain all of mythology through this lens, and it does so, but it does so by explaining all narrative through this lens. I will say that Joseph Campbell did give 4 functions of myth, and I think they're valuable because ancient myth actually does follow these 4 functions. So let's just go over them. There's the metaphysical function of myth, and that is, myth confronts the unknowable. Sure enough, you're hearing or reading all these mythic stories of giant creatures and heroes and outrageous events. It is a confrontation with a profound other. It's a confrontation with what is not known. Very often, the hero has to descend into the underworld, into the unknown. And in a very real way, myth then takes individual human consciousness and confronts it with all the boundaries that surround it in an attempt to process that, because that is what every human being encounters. Our worlds are metaphysical constructions. We're always encountering the unknown. So there's this metaphysical function of myth, the encounter of awe with nature, with the unknown. Campbell says there's a cosmological explanation or function of myth, and that is, myth serves to explain the world and its origins. And this is true. One of the basic functions of ancient mythologies was to explain the origin of things. And so we will add on to that a little bit later. There's a sociological function of myth, and that is, myth serves to uphold the social order. There are, the most common scene carved on Greek thrones of the Greek kings in the city-states were the labors of Heracles. So if you sat in a throne, you were actually taking on the persona of Heracles. And what that tells us is that the story, the myth of Heracles, provided a social basis of how kingship worked. The king overcame the lion. The king defeated the Hydra. The king was the strongest person in the city-state, could defeat the unknown, could defeat all the mythological creatures, or your enemies across the river. The king had to have the persona and the character and the fortitude of Heracles. The myth then serves to provide a model for the social order, or in this case, for kingship. The last function Joseph Campbell gives myth is the psychological function, which is the most important function for him, and that is, myth provides meaning to the individual. Each narrative puts the individual on their own hero's journey so that they can face whatever their own problems, obstacles, antagonists are in front of them, no matter where they live, no matter what they do. And so this actually turns ancient mythology into sort of a devotional interpretation of ancient myth. You can now recontextualize ancient myth by applying it to yourself and then seeing, what collective unconscious archetype is at play that will help me in my own life. This is why Campbell was so popular, by the way. It's also why so many academics deconstructed Campbell, because this kind of personally applying myth to a person is not very popular in academia. All right. Finally, there is a school of myth called structuralism. Again, it's really not a school of myth. Structuralism is a theory of culture, theory of society. It's was big in the mid 20th century. Claude Lévi-Strauss, there's a picture of him right here on the screen, is the proponent, a French anthropologist, and really it's an anthropological theory of culture. The downside to structuralism is Lévi-Strauss wrote so densely and academically that it really is a labor of love to try to get through his work. So I'm not going to, get too deep into it and bore you. However, his work was very influential. And what Lévi-Strauss showed is that mythologies, and by the way, like Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, to prove his theory of culture, how cultures are structured, i.e. structuralism, Lévi-Strauss compiled a rich, deep assortment of mythologies. So his work is one of the most dense collections of mythological data that's ever been compiled. So for that alone, a brilliant academic in the study of myth. What Lévi-Strauss would do is he would find a myth, as many versions of the myth that he could find, and he would compare them and pull out what they all had in common. And these he would call myth themes. These are the common mythic motifs, units of each of the variations. And then he would line them up. And sure enough, when he did that, he saw that the myth themes were often, almost always, binary opposites. So that one myth theme was an opposite of another myth theme, opposite of another one, opposite of another one. And so that the structure of a mythic narrative was this thesis, antithesis, synthesis. They were binary opposites that would meet in the narrative. These oppositions would synthesize in some way and create a new series of oppositions, which would have to synthesize, and on it went. And basically, he is describing this is how human culture develops, human psyche develops through the confrontation and synthesis of oppositions. We can give an example of this, by the way, using the Bible, because if you just take the narrative units in the creation story, for example, what do we find? Well, here in the garden, we find two trees that are binary opposites: the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, which, if you partake of, brings death. Right? So here we have two trees, life and death, two binary opposites. And if you go another step, the tree of life is a binary opposite itself. It offers eternal life, but it's guarded with cherubim and a flaming sword, which brings death. Right? And so the tree of life itself is an opposite, whereas the tree of knowledge is also an opposite. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. All right, so the two trees are opposites. Each tree is an opposite. The stewards of the trees are opposites. There is God speaking in the garden, and then there is a serpent enticing Adam and Eve to partake, right? And then there are the humans, which are opposites. Adam, the man, Eve, the woman, who then must encounter the tree of knowledge, learn good and evil through the stewards of God and the serpent. And so the entire narrative is one opposition coming into alignment, synthesizing, entering another opposition, synthesizing another opposition, and on and on and on we go. Adam and Eve have two children. One's a farmer, one's a shepherd, two opposites, and one kills the other, two opposites. And so these narratives then, Lévi-Strauss's insight of how these narratives align oppositions tends to be correct. It tends to be insightful. So then now the question is, why is that happening? So the psychological theory of myth will talk about the collective unconscious. Lévi-Strauss will talk about linguistics. The myth ritual school will try to find a ritual that's being performed. This is how they're approaching this different material. All right, well, let's try to close up here. As I was studying in graduate school studying mythology, really what you do is you study the theories of mythology. And as I'm studying these different theories, two things really stick out to me. One, quite remarkably, in the 20th century, you have these major theories of myth, and they all omit orality studies. Now, in part, that's because a lot of these theories are percolating, emerging out of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and orality studies really doesn't start picking up steam until the 1960s and 70s. And so the field of studies, of orality studies, isn't really developed until, the psychological school, until all these modern theories have already established themselves. But after reading them, I realized myth is primarily an oral product. And I think you have to start in trying to conceptualize how ancient myth worked in the ancient world by actually reading a lot of this work from the academic study of orality. Walter Ong, Eric Havelock, Milman Perry, Albert Lord, Marshall McLuhan, on and on. As you've gone through my concept presentations, clearly I'm relying very heavily on orality and literacy as a way to conceptualize how ancient societies worked, from which our biblical world was developed in an oral society, which means early biblical religion would be an oral religion. And that is not how we teach it. We teach it wholly as a literate religion. It becomes that, but there's a difference. The other huge lacuna in our modern myth theories is that in oral societies, there is a deep cosmological structure and sense. This is fundamental to the culture. And I didn't really begin getting a sense of this until in about a year's time I had read, at least a dozen books that really opened my eyes to how ancient oral societies were deeply embedded with the celestial cycles around them. Literally, in oral cultures, if a certain star rises on the horizon and a plant grows, they link the two. They think analogically. That star is causing that plant to grow. Right? This is where we get astrology from. This is analogical structures of thought in oral societies. Well, there is a tight, close-knit relationship with oral societies and celestial cycles, sun, moon, and stars. Oral peoples think cosmologically. And I slowly began learning this as I was reading these different books. Conversations with Oga Temeli is about a West African tribe, the Dogon. It's written by a French anthropologist, Grial. He lived with the Dogon for 15 years. You would think he knew everything, but at the end of that 15 years, there's this last priest, Oga Temeli, who trusts him now after 15 years and says, look, I'm about to die. No one in my own people know our traditions the way I know them. I need to pass them on before I die. And so they have this several days where they just talk. Oga Temeli talks to the French anthropologist, and he lays out a cosmovision of the ancient Dogon, and it is so cosmological in its structure. It's related to the sun, stars, and moon. It's related to celestial cycles, but every aspect of the culture is interwoven with that. And so reading that is an eye-opener, just because if you read anything Egyptian, ancient Egyptian, you get a sense that that is how Egypt is structured. But, I was taking this class on African religion by Laura Grillo out of University of Chicago. And in addition to that, I read a book, Ritual Mass, written by her partner or husband, Henry Prenay, on African ritual mass and how they are deeply cosmological in their symbolic functions. I read The Divine Horseman, which is about Haiti, the African diaspora, voodooism. That's one of the best books I've ever read. It's about Haitian myth, ritual, cosmology. And you start getting a sense that, wow, the myths, the rituals, and the cosmology are inseparable. And so I'm reading these theories of myth, the psychological, structural, ritual, but they're omitting this part of it. Well, all of this comes from Africa that I'm reading. And so I thought, well, is it different anywhere else? And so I began in that same year reading books on Native American culture, myth. And I read a collection of essays edited by Vondell Chamberlain, Songs from the Sky. One of those essays just was a repeat of what Conversations of Ogatameli were. There was a medicine man, Native American, last of his tribe, who told a Western anthropologist the traditions of the Lakota that no one else knew, and it was all cosmological based. And after reading that, I mean, my jaw's on the floor. Maya Cosmos, how the Maya integrated celestial cycles and everything they did. Black Elk Speaks, still one of the best books I've ever read. Bottom line is, here are two huge threads that these previous theories of myth did not incorporate. Orality studies, cosmological structures, and they are essential to ancient cultures. So as I continued my work, figure out, how these incorporate into the theories of myth. The last problem with the modern theories of myth is they're all universalist theories. They're all trying to explain all, once you see, a mushroom in a myth, suddenly you want to put a mushroom in every myth, right? Once you develop this vision of what myth is, then it's the vision that you imprint everywhere. This is your universalist viewpoint. And it's problematic because it doesn't work that way. Some myths are deeply cosmological, but some really are just dealing with a plant or a historical person or a festival. All right, so basically this is my own synthesis of many years of study as to how the mythic canon, how oral peoples operate, and how they incorporate myth or create myth. Oral peoples observe nature of the above and below. The above, celestial cycles; the below, natural cycles, agriculture, migrations of animals, birds, fish, weather patterns, right? Religious concerns, human maturation, pregnancy, afterlife, beliefs. But they are in some way all related to each other because they think analogically. And so very often they personify principles of nature. When the sun is in this position on the horizon, it's time to plant. So the sun in this position on the horizon, we'll call a name. It becomes a deity, right? Oral peoples are polytheists because they divide the functions of nature by personifications of nature, which becomes the deities in their pantheons. This is simply a function of oral cognition, all related to cosmological and natural processes. Well, then how to pass that information on? Well, you tell a story. You personify the principle of nature. Now that personification is a figure in a narrative, a god or a hero or an animal or, a spirit. And then you start telling stories which explain the phenomenon happening around you or the origins of the phenomenon happening around you in a oral narrative. This is your myth attached to the cosmology of the culture. Well, again, because oral peoples need to they need to repeat their memories in different mediums. And so not only are they telling an oral story, they're acting them out. And this is why myth and ritual are partners. Myth and ritual, a ritual is a dramatization of a myth. Very often a myth is actually just expressing some aspect of a ritual that is being performed during a specific time of year in the cosmological cycle. So these things are all related. Finally, very often there's a sacred loci, a sacred space in which the myths are told, the rituals are performed, and the cosmos is observed. And this is our temple. It doesn't have to be a grand stone structure. It can be a standing stone, a stone ring, a cave, a tree, a lake, right? A field, whatever the sacred axis mundi is of the culture. So it is these four layers that, for me, constitute how oral societies function. Myth, then, is the oral narrative aspect of this complex of oral cognition. So what that tells us is simply this. I guess my definition of myth will have its own problems, but myth is the sacralized narrative of the formal oral canon of memory. So it's the oral narrative aspect of this mythic canon of memory. The point is this. If there are narratives in the Bible that descend from the oral tradition, that oral tradition is descending from this complex. It's not descending from a text. It's not descending from textual prejudices or the way literate peoples think. This is how oral peoples organize their thinking. So if there are stories in the Bible that descend from oral tradition, can we find aspects of those narratives related to the ancient temple cult? Can we find ancient cosmological structures out of the Near East or Egypt or the Mediterranean that somehow link or compare to the motifs in our narrative in the Bible? Are there other mythologies or are there rituals either detailed in the Bible or around with surrounding cultures? The bottom line is, if there is a story descended from oral narrative in the Bible, can we lift any of the fingerprints of the oral structure of thought in that story? Because that will actually really illuminate, perhaps even fundamentally change the meaning of the story if we can find those things. So this is the approach of myth in the Bible.